thank you everyone for coming here on a Friday night. Many of you would have had other plans, which you've probably changed to be here. I saw Kate at the Pocket Gaming event, right? Which was, I think, last year. Was it earlier
January this
It was
year.
January this year.
Yeah.
She was amazing, very, very inspiring. And so I'm glad that she could take time out of a very busy schedule of traveling, come here at London Business School and present to us about her own career in gaming and all the amazing work she's been doing in terms of the culture in video games. So I won't take up any more of your time. Thank you for being here, and please give it to Kate Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you. And you can all hear me just fine? Okay. Yeah, I've got one of those loud American voices. So, but yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. This is my 8th talk in 3.5 weeks. I'm heading home tomorrow. I'm based in Seattle. I get to be home for 3 days before I have to leave again, but woohoo, 3 days, that's gonna be nice. But the title of this talk, this is a bit autobiographical in a way, but it does delve deep into the work that I've been doing in the game industry now for over 30 years. And the title of this talk comes from the quote from Teddy Roosevelt that some of you may have heard before, and it may not be in vogue to quote American presidents, but I like the quote, where he said, "Far better it is to dare mighty things to achieve glorious triumphs, than to take, even though checkered with failure, than to take rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much because they live in the gray twilight that knows not victory nor defeat." Now, I learned that in my undergraduate college days way back when, and it just really stuck with me. And I've loved that quote. It's been used in all kinds of ways in different Americana, but it's really kind of been sort of a driving quote. When I look back on my career, it's really something that has kind of defined what I've done. And I say 5 key lessons. That's just because it's within about 45 minutes. There's many lessons. But these are 5 lessons that I think are, for me, very important. Oh, we don't want to do that. Sorry. Don't use the mouse. Use this. There we go. So here's a few numbers. If numbers define us, these are a few that define me. I turned 60 this year. I've been in the industry for 32 years. My very first game was Flight Sim 5.0 way back in my early Microsoft days. I've been self-employed for 20 years as of April 1st. I was 13 years at Microsoft during some very formative years of the company, especially when it came to games. I ran the International Game Developers Association for 5 years, and I also ran the Global Game Jam, which is the world's largest game creation event that happens every January. I ran that for 3 years, and I'm still on the board. And as of last week, I started on my 298th game. So it's been really busy, and just because of the nature of my work, I tend to be working on 10 to 15 games at any given time. So that's where it kind of stacks up very quickly. When I knew I was reaching my 30th year in games, I kind of sat back over the holidays and actually went through and added up every single game I worked on. I thought it was maybe 120, 150, but I was surprised, let's put it that way. These are some of the franchises I've worked on. You've probably recognized some of these games. So yeah, I've worked on a lot of stuff, you know, and like with some of these, like Mass Effect, Age of Empires, Dragon Age, I've worked on all of those games over the years. You know, and Age of Empires is the longest franchise I've been working on. I started on that when it was conceived in 1997, and I'm still working on it. In fact, when I go back to my hotel room this evening, I have to do some work on one of the DLC campaigns that's releasing very soon. So this is some of the work that I've been doing. Basically, the way I would sum up what I do as a geographer working in the game industry is that I explore this interaction between what is real, all the real geography outside these walls, and then what is represented in the game worlds, what do the game developers create, whether it's fantasy or real world environments, and then what is perceived, which to me is the most important part. How do players and the public perceive the world that was built and the intentions behind that world? I'm originally from Los Angeles, which you can see in the background, but of course that's Los Santos from Grand Theft Auto 5. But I think they did a really amazing job of making a great parody of LA when they created Los Santos. For all effects and purposes, it's Los Angeles. So lesson number 1, I think it's really important to embrace the passions that defined you, because when I look back on my career, every single turn I made was defined by something that I actually really enjoyed when I was a kid. And there were certain things that happened in my generation that were very formative, not just for me, but for my generation. For example, I was 4 years old when we landed on the moon. I remember, this is not me, but I remember doing exactly this, watching it on my grandmother's black and white TV, and just wondering, this is mind-blowing, you know, and, you know, so it really influenced me. I just had this incredible fascination with space. I mean, to this day, I'm still kind of obsessed, you know, walking around with my NASA backpack and all that stuff. So that was a huge deal for me. I mean, my parents let me stay home to watch certain space events if it happened during school hours, like the Apollo-Soyuz connection back in the 70s when the Russians and US got together, amazingly. So yeah, it was a very big influence on me. This was also a tremendous influence, which you may not be able to tell right away what this is. This is the original hand-drawn map that Tolkien drafted to create this, which I think most all of us recognize. And this was the reason I became a cartographer, because I was so immersed in Middle-earth. I was introduced to it in my elementary school days, so around, you know, 3rd grade, 4th grade. And like many people, I've been obsessed by it ever since. But the idea of using cartography to bring a fictional world to life just fascinated me. And of course, most fantasy authors have done the same. C.S. Lewis did it. I mean, you know, you think about all the different fantasy novels out there and series, they all basically use a map to establish a certain reality for the world that they've built. And so I just, you know, I would look at this and just kind of get lost in it in the same way I did with the globe. Now, this isn't the globe I had, but I had a globe almost exactly like this. My brother and I shared it, my older brother, who used to throw it at me quite a bit. But we had a globe like this, and like many kids, I was just like spend hours looking at the globe or looking in an atlas. I mean, that's one thing I can say as a cartographer. I have never, ever met somebody who said, I hate maps. Maps are disgusting. I really don't like them. So there's a certain fascination I think we have with this representation of the world, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. This, of course, was also a huge influence. I'm old enough to remember when this showed up in stores way back when I was about 7 years old. Now, if you've seen the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the monolith appears and the apes evolve because of it, that's my generation. This thing showed up and we just became different people because now video games entered our lives. And I've been a gamer ever since then. I never imagined working on games, but just, you know, fascinated with games. I was in the era in the early 80s when I was in high school where there were no internet, no cell phones, no personal computers. So what did we do? Your entire social network of school revolved around the video game arcade. Everything happened there. Breakups, get-togethers, fights, everything. It was a glorious time. But and I also love the fact that, that games have been part of human history since the very beginning. It's one of the oldest activities that we have done as a civilization. And these are just some of the examples. Of course, just, you know, not too far away, you've got this in the British Museum, the oldest example of a game from Babylonia. And it's amazing that we actually know the rules. We know how to play this game. So it's an activity that's been around a long time. And oftentimes when I have discussions with government officials where they're like kind of a little bit off-put by video games and the influence they're having, because it is a very pervasive medium, but I have to remind them that we've always been doing it. That's what we do as human beings. Play is something that's very integral to who we are. And then Star Wars. I was 12 years old when the original Star Wars film came out in 1977. And again, complete reality changing for the people of my generation because we've never seen anything even remotely like that. There'd been some things, you know, here and there, but nothing to that scale. And so being from Southern California, I did not see it at the Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood when it opened that day. I got to see it here about 2 weeks after it opened. But yeah, it was just, you know, completely shaped our reality. And it influenced me so much that it kind of started a passion, obsession, hobby that I've had, which is visiting filming locations. And that has persisted in me ever since I was a teenager. Even when, you know, going to Skellig Michael off Ireland, when I had to speak at a conference in Ireland a few years ago, of course, what do? You go out to the island and you recreate scenes because why not? Yeah, I didn't have a lightsaber, I had an umbrella, but, and I love doing this so much that during COVID, when I was stuck at home for 18 months, because typically I travel about 75% of the year to speak. This is Dubrovnik in Croatia, where they film Game of Thrones. I actually co-founded a company called Setjetters. So we actually have an app on iOS and Android that helps you find filming locations. In fact, you know, being in London, they're like everywhere. It's like almost every corner around here has a filming location of some kind. So that's been a really fun distraction as well. So this is basically what my career path has looked like. And all of those passions influenced, you can kind of see bits and pieces of them in here. I did actually want to be an astronaut right out of high school. I did aerospace engineering for 1 year, and the calculus killed me because I'm left-handed, right-brained. It just like, so I switched to being a conceptual artist because I really wanted to work on a Star Wars film really bad. I did industrial design because the artists at that time at Lucasfilm, that was their background. I actually went to the same school in Southern California that they did to get those skills. But then I decided, I really love maps, I love travel, I love culture, so I'm going to use those skills to make maps and go into geography. And so basically this was the career path, and it was all influenced by those passions in one way or another. My kind of obsession with technology, which led me to doing VR research way back in the 90s, which I'll show in a minute, and then Microsoft and so on, and I'll get into some of this other stuff more. The second lesson that I would recommend is that the world is not ready for all your ideas, but you need to do them anyway. And that's something I have learned over and over again. We all have naysayers who basically tell us, hey, I don't really think that's going to be viable. I don't think it's going to be a good idea. Screw them. Just try and do it anyway. So again, going back to my roots, when I started my career, finished my degree, in my undergraduate degree, as well as my graduate degrees, and then, as a cartographer, our goal is to do what? We take this object, which we're all familiar with, and we turn it into this. We want to make a representation of the world, which to me is something like a world-building exercise. You're trying to take certain phenomenon of the real world and simplify it and generalize it to make it more understandable, and of course, overlay culture like political boundaries or other things as well. And then, again, of course, the oldest map of the world, also in the same place a few streets away. So these are images from my master's thesis that I did on my old Macintosh way back in 1991. So I saw the promise of VR way back then because on my campus at the University of Washington in Seattle, there was a VR lab that had just gotten started. It's called the Human Interface Technology Lab. Tom Furness, who invented VR in the US Air Force, he retired. He became a professor at the UW, and he set up this lab. And so I just literally ran into these people on campus one day when they were setting up the lab and rolling equipment into a building. And I asked them, what is this? So they said, well, we're setting up a VR lab. And I'm like, what's VR? They're like, well, come in, we'll show you what it is. And so I got really interested in this whole idea of like objective reality, virtual reality, the interplay between the two, the perceptual reality that we have. I asserted in my master's thesis things about like using AR so we can, have utility workers see pipes under the street with their glasses, which kind of look like a Apple Vision Pro. But, kind of trying to think about what would it look like. And I also even talked about using VR and eye tracking technology to teach AI how humans see the world. Because I thought this would be, because eye tracking technology back in those days was a really big part of the early VR discussions. And so I thought, if we took these units out into the world and start interacting with the world, the AI can see what we see and we can help it basically understand exactly what's happening with the real phenomenon. But anyway, that's how I started. So that was already a combination of an interest in geography and cartography, but also technology. Well, as I was doing finished my master's thesis, starting my PhD, that's when Microsoft called our geography department and said, hey, we need a cartographer to help us make some products over here. This is way back in 91, just right after I finished my master's. And so I had just gotten married. I was a starving grad student, and the money was good. So I said, sure, I'll go over. And on a contract basis, I went over on a 6-month contract and helped them make all the maps for Encarta Encyclopedia, which if you don't know what that is the last major encyclopedia that existed before Wikipedia. So Microsoft made this product. They released it way back in 1993. And it was the dominant encyclopedia for about 10 years or so, because it released with every version of Windows. And so it was very pervasive. There's like a whole generation of people who are like 30s and 40s who are like, oh my God, I remember Encarta. And I also went on to help create Encarta World Atlas, which was actually the precursor to Google Earth. So this was a vector-drawn globe that we had to pitch directly to Bill Gates, because back in those days, he approved every single product idea at Microsoft. So I was part of this small team that pitched it to him directly. He said it's impossible. You cannot render vector data in real time on a 286 PC. But he said, prove me wrong. So he gave us a chance to do it, and we did. It took about a year and a half, but we proved him wrong. So that's how I got started at Microsoft. And in those days, while my first job was just to do cartography there, Microsoft started to do a huge push into making a lot of mapping products. They saw the potential here. So they said, we're going to make other mapping products. They had a business one called MapPoint. They had a travel one called Streets and Trips, in addition to Encarta World Atlas and the maps in the encyclopedia as well. But then we started running into some problems. So this is actually one of the examples of the very map I made for the original Encarta. Yes, it was bitmap, and I did draw every one of those little mountains and everything, because that was how we did it back in those days. So this map in 1995 was the reason why the subsidiary manager for Turkey was thrown in jail. Because, as you might be able to guess, because of the name Kurdistan. Because back in those days, Kurdistan still remains a very sensitive topic in Turkey when you use that phrase. But back then, they had the PKK terrorist group that was bombing inside Turkey, which was, a proponent of Kurdish independence. And so it was a very sensitive issue. So they took our subsidiary manager, put him in jail, and said, take this off the map or he's not coming out. So we took it off the map, although we did not remove the article from Encarta because we're not going to go that far. We have our limits as well. But we said, fine, we'll just take it off the map, but the article about Kurdistan still exists, which they didn't really like, but they at least let him out of jail. Same year, a few months later, we had an issue with Windows 95, which was like a huge, big new version of Windows that Microsoft was making a big deal about. Now, in the old days of Windows, when you would select the time zone that you're in, it would highlight the time zone, which of course most time zones are longitudinal because they are a 1 hour time zone. But because India is a half-hour time zone, you're going to see the outline of the country. And so this is the reason why the Indian government banned Windows 95, because they felt that their claim over Kashmir, which is disputed between China, India, and Pakistan, was not covered. So there was a few pixels missing, and to them that was enough to ban the product because we were not showing their claim correctly, which is something that they have done many, many times over. I've seen them ban games because of it. I've seen them ban other products that has a map in it. So because of this, I guess it's now 30 years now, Windows has not highlighted time zones ever again. So we turned off that feature, so we're not going to have that problem anymore. And then we had a big issue in 1997, a couple years later, as we had Encarta World Atlas. This is what you're seeing here is that in the lower right, that's North Korea, and up in the rest is China. And this is the boundary between the two. That lake there, Lake Cheonji, is basically a sacred place for the Korean people, but particularly the peak, Baekdusan, which is on the rim, because this is basically a crater lake. And the highest point of that rim lies within North Korea. Well, originally our map looked like the one on the left. That was data from the US government that we were using because it's free. Our tax money pays for that. But their data was incorrect. As you can see, the entire feature is shown within China. That became front page news in South Korea. The government got very upset at us. And so they basically started looking at everything in Microsoft, looking for errors in the encyclopedia, in other products, on maps. They gave us this massive long list. Here's all the things you need to fix. We fixed a few of them, not everything, because let's face it, a lot of the things they were requesting was a very specific political viewpoint that we could not verify. But this we could. So I was able to verify using maps from China, and I actually was able to get maps from North Korea via my Korean contacts. So we found out that the lake is actually bisected by the boundary. So we actually changed this before a lot of other major cartographic houses did, because they were still using the old US government data. So big PR mess, big government relations problem. We kind of had it quiet down. The government kind of said, okay, fine, you fixed it, great. Well, 3 months later, this product comes out, Age of Empires. And this product had a scenario that takes place in Korea. And this had some of the errors that the Korean government said we should fix that we didn't. And so what happened in this scenario is that we had this scenario that you see here, which most history books outside of Korea tells us this is what happened. The Japanese in the Middle Ages, in blue, they invaded the Korean peninsula, the Chosun Empire, and basically almost took it over. So the game developers are saying, that is a great scenario. You're going to play as the Chosun trying to stop this massive Japanese invasion. So it's going to be really challenging. So great. So we put it in the game. The game comes out. Day one, it's banned by the government. And why did they ban it? Because they said this never happened. There's no evidence that the Japanese invaded like this. We're like, huh. all the historians working with us said it happened. So but yeah, so then we had a problem though, because not only did we know from our market research that Korea is an extremely important gaming market, and it remains so to this day, we also knew from market research that real-time strategy games like Age of Empires are very, very popular in Korea. In fact, 1 year later is when StarCraft came out, when StarCraft became a national phenomenon in Korea, and that's also a real-time strategy game. So we basically had no choice. We're like, we can't not sell this. We have to sell this into Korea, so what are we going to do? So what we did is we created a patch only for Korean players that changed history. So now Korea is invading Japan. And as you can imagine, this created a huge debate on the team about the nature of truth and ethics. Like, why are we serving up government propaganda to essentially sell this product in that market? And this is where I started to really get into my zone here and understanding that this is a massive problem, a huge risk exposure for Microsoft, because we just made that mistake with Encarta. The government was really angry. Well, when they saw this, they got really upset to the point where Bill Gates got involved, and they basically said, we are like this close to shutting down all of Microsoft's business. No Office, no Windows, and that's when like all the higher ups are like, we have to do something about this. And so we released the patch, but it took a lot of government relations work with the Korean subsidiary, with Redmond headquarters, to try and get this Korean government to back off and don't ban us. We made a mistake, and we had to explain to them. Age of Empires was made in Dallas, Texas by Ensemble Studios. Encarta is made in the Seattle area by the Encarta team. They are 2,000 miles apart. They have no reason to even know each other exists, even though they all are under the Microsoft banner. So for a company of that size, this was a huge problem. And I saw this as a massive risk area for the company. So what I did, as a result of this, I wrote a proposal for the creation of a new kind of team at Microsoft that I called geopolitical strategy. And so because of this, I started a process of pitching my idea to different VPs in the company. First, I went to the VP of my division, pitched it to him. He rejected it, said, cool idea, but I don't think we need this. And then over the next 7 months, I would go on to pitch it to 3 other VPs, all of whom rejected it. And then the only reason I kept going is because I had a cloud of people around me from different product teams who were feeling this pain. They kept saying, don't stop. We need this. We need some resource like this. So finally, I got an introduction to Paul Moritz, who was one of the VPs at Microsoft at the time. And when I met with him, I'll get there in a second. But when I met with him, he improved it in like 2 minutes. And I think the main reason he did is because he was the only VP I talked to was not from the US. He was from South Africa. So I think he very much understood what I was trying to do. And just to give you some sense of the climate around Microsoft at the time, one reason it was so critical, because Microsoft was under a tremendous amount of scrutiny, especially not just on the global stage, but in the US. This is when the Department of Justice in the US actually sued Microsoft for being a monopoly. And Microsoft had grown extremely fast. There was a lot of kind of jokes about it. I mean, honestly, this is my favorite one right here. But there was a lot of commentary about Microsoft's growing power and political influence. And we've heard this before, right? We've heard this about Meta. We've heard it about Google and other companies that have come since. But Microsoft was the main target back in the late 90s, which is when I was there. So I felt it was even more critical for this team to exist because we were under this kind of scrutiny from media and from governments. So April 7th, 1998, that's when I had that meeting with Paul Moritz. That's when he approved my team. This was the mission of the team as I created it. That's the logo I made in Photoshop way back when, using the 4 Windows colors on the compass rose and the UN blue for the background. Why not? Yeah, I did make it look kind of very federal or official. We actually, just because it was so not Microsoft to do something like this, so it kind of really stood out within the company. So yeah, I guess I was going for like a NATO thing or who knows. But anyway, my team was created. And so now I had a mandate. It wasn't just doing the mapping products. Now it was everything. All the products at Microsoft, Windows, Office, Internet Explorer, all the games. But the games were they were sort of pushing back. Robbie Bach, who was the senior VP of the division at the time, he was just like, well, we don't really need this kind of oversight. Games are edgy and cool. We're allowed to be offensive every once in a while. I'm like, I don't think Bill Gates is going to agree with that. But, you can take that risk. But that's the thing, is that once I created this team, I was the one who had to go face Bill in person and explain to him why a product was banned or what we're supposed to do about it. That was a bit intimidating. That took some getting used to in order to kind of, because you cannot show fear, you cannot show doubt, because it's like sharks. It's like one drop of blood in the water and they come at you. So so that was the thing. If you have an idea, try it anyway. Even if it's going to be difficult, I encourage you to try it. The third lesson is that culture impacts everything. Everything that we do within the teams, within the worlds we build, even if it's not a game. Information products, to me, are information worlds. We are designing a world of information that people interact with. So essentially, if I were to simplify the job that I do in the game industry, I look at the game worlds that these developers are creating, and I see if they're going to be compatible with the local worldviews of these different cultures and markets. And so to me, it's sort of like a gene splicing exercise where my goal is to preserve the creative vision of the developers, because that's the key idea. It's their vision, it's their idea, but I have to make sure that it's going to work in as many places as possible. So that's where I'm working in this zone, looking at content assets, like anything you can imagine, environments, the narrative, character design, gestures in dancing games, everything, to see whether or not it's going to be compatible or incompatible with the different markets. And then I go back to them with a recommendation and say, here's your options. You have to choose because you're the creator. I'm not going to choose for you. Now, when I was at Microsoft, I was the one often having to make the decision for them because they were resistant. And I had to protect the brand. And so that was one of my key jobs. So I had to make the decision. And sometimes I had to escalate, which I'll have an example of that in a bit. One aspect of culturalization is what I call reactive culturalization. This is what a lot of the clients I have pay me for, which is to look for things that are offensive or problematic. So this is from the game Fallout 3 that I worked on some years back, and this is a two-headed Brahmin bull. And as you can see, it looks kind of emaciated, and it's two-headed. It's a radioactive mutant. This is the whole reason why the game did not release in India, because in India, Brahmin bulls are sacred to the Hindu faith, and they actually have laws that protect real Brahmin bulls from being harmed. And there was a concern that those laws might be extended to a virtual representation of a Brahmin bull. So we went back to the team and said, why don't you swap it out for something like my poorly photoshopped two-headed horse? Because this would have been totally fine, but they were just like, nope, we don't want to mess with it at this point. It was late in the development cycle. We don't want to break the game. So they basically said, no, we're not going to do it. Even though we were saying India is a huge emerging market for game consumption, they're just like, yeah, we don't care. Now, I think today they would make a different decision, honestly, but back then they decided it wasn't worth the trouble. But we also do things like what I call proactive culturalization. So we look for opportunities to enhance the game experience for a specific market. So this is the mobile game Temple Run 2 that I worked on. And what you're seeing here is the special skin we did for Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead holiday in Mexico. So the team was seeing a certain uptick in interest in the game and downloads of the game in Mexico. So they said, why don't we reward that interest by doing a special live ops holiday version for Day of the Dead? And what we did was reskin the game. It wasn't a massive effort. It just took a little bit of artistic asset changes. We obviously changed the characters, their ethnicity, put them in clothing that is authentic for the Day of the Dead holiday. We used elements like the marigolds and the calaveras and whatnot and put them in the environment. And so we released the game around Day of the Dead, and the sales just shot through the roof. The response was so positive to doing this. And so it did so well that we actually did another version for the Holi holiday in India, the Festival of the Colors. And that also saw a similar huge jump in sales. And so there's a way to use culture not just to find things that are bad, but also look for ways to enhance the experience for certain cultures or markets. One aspect that we often have to deal with is this idea that I call allegorical distance, because so many games, especially if they're sci-fi or fantasy games, they use elements of the real world as inspiration for elements in the fantasy or sci-fi world. So they start with the real world, and then they kind of evolve it into something different, into the fictional universe. So what that is, to me, is when we start with an allegory, and I will explain this a little bit more, we have to put in the work, the creative work, to make sure that it's not too obvious. Now, that's unless you want it to be obvious. And of course, there are examples of it being super obvious in TV and film If you've ever watched the original Twilight Zones from the 1960s or the original Star Trek from the 1960s, they were masters of allegory because they had to be, because they were not allowed to talk about really hot topics of the day. I mean, like racism, the Cold War, and things like that. But they did a fantastic job of masking those issues in sci-fi or in kind of a fantasy way. So what we do is we think about, when we're using the inspiration of something from the real world, how much effort is it for a player to perceive the real world inspiration from that implementation in the game? So, again, we start with the real world inspiration, and that allegorical distance is something, that we have to work on. But oftentimes, in my experience, a lot of game developers just don't put in the creative work. For example, every game, every fantasy world or sci-fi world I've ever worked on that has a desert environment, what do the people look like? They are dressed in robes. They have a Bedouin feeling to them from the Arabian Peninsula or from North Africa. They almost all look the same. I mean, even Dune did it a little bit, even though Dune was an extrapolation of that exact culture into the far future. But still, they basically take on that inspiration. So I'll give you a few examples of distance. So I mentioned Grand Theft Auto 5 earlier, and it takes place in this fictional LA, which is Los Santos. But they made no secret that it's LA. No, everybody knows that it's Los Angeles. They just call it Los Santos because what it does, and it's actually very effective, it lets them step one step out of reality, in often what I call hyperreal, where it basically they can do whatever they want to this place. Now, people, local Angelinos might get upset and say, "You can't do that to this building." It's like, well, it's not really that building, is it? It's something different, even though it looks almost exactly the same. And Marvel does this too. Rather than deal with real-world geopolitics, that's why they create Wakanda, they create Sokovia and all these fictional countries, so that they're able to kind of have creative license and tell the story they want to tell without making somebody upset. So Grand Theft Auto 5 is a very small allegorical distance because you pretty much know what they're doing. It's about Los Angeles. Whereas Dragon Age, this universe, when we created these games, there was a certain race in the game, the Dalish Elves, that were created, and the Dalish Elves are basically the opposite of how most elves are treated in a lot of fantasy worlds, especially Tolkien. So in Tolkien's universe, elves are like these lofty, angelic, immortal beings who seem to be kind of perfect, even though they're not really. But in the Dragon Age universe, the narrative designers purposely took the elves and took them down to basically an untouchable caste of people in the social structure. They're outcasts. And what the whole intention of this was, they really wanted to make a commentary about how people, especially Latin Americans, are treated when they immigrate into the United States. And so they were making, and this is a game that was made chiefly by Canadians. So they were making a comment and using allegory to comment on how immigrants are treated in the U.S. And so a lot of players did not pick up on this at all, but they were kind of wondering, why are the elves treated so poorly? Why is everyone like kicking them around? But we did have some players, especially those from immigrant backgrounds, who did pick up on this because they said, I know what this feels like, or my parents know what this feels like. That kind of resonates with me. So I would say that's moderate allegorical distance because the team intended it to be that way, but they were kind of trying to make sure it wasn't too obvious because it is, after all, a complete fantasy world. Like you can see, they did not make them look or sound Hispanic, for example, because that would have been maybe a little too obvious. Another one where the allegorical distance is high is the game Halo 2. This is a sci-fi game that takes place about 500 years in the future. If you haven't played Halo, then I need to set it up for you just briefly. So in this game, there's a group of aliens, different alien races that all work together. They're called the Covenant. They're run by 3 leaders. All 3 of them are called prophets. One of them is called the Prophet of Truth, which I flagged because it's an often used synonym for Muhammad. But I said, I'm going to let that go because defensively you could say that Prophet of Truth could be used for any religious figure. So you say, I would say that's defensible. So what the Covenant's trying to do under the leadership of the prophets is activate these alien artifacts, these Halo rings that they did not build. There's 7 of them around the galaxy. So when they activate them, it's going to destroy all sentient life in the galaxy. It's what they call the Great Journey. It's a religious action on their part. So they're going to basically, for religious reasons, activate these massive WMDs that kill sentient life in the galaxy. And then who's trying to stop them? There's a super soldier with an American accent named Master Chief. And so he's the main protagonist who's trying to stop the Covenant. And then in Halo 2, they introduced this character who has a key role in the whole narrative of the game. He's an agent of the Covenant, and he's trying to stop the Master Chief and who's trying to stop their plans. His original name was Dervish. Now I thought we have a problem because Dervish is a title from Sufi Islam. So now you've got the Dervish serving the Prophet of Truth, religious group, setting off WMDs, American soldier trying to stop them. And to make this even better, this is the first major game release after 9/11. So to me, this was a huge problem. Now the team kept saying this was not intended allegory at all. But to this day, I'm very suspicious of that because it was just, to me, a little too obvious. Nonetheless, I tested this with my colleagues in the MENA region within Microsoft. I sent them a paragraph. I didn't set it up. I just said, read this and let me know if you have any thoughts. So more than half of them came back to me right away and said, I see a revenge fantasy of the US against Islam for 9/11. I'm like, thank you. That's what I see too. So what we ended up doing was basically doing one thing, which I felt created more allegorical dissonance, which is get rid of Dervish. And so that's why this character became the Arbiter in the game and is known in the Halo universe as the Arbiter, which I frankly think is a much better name for the character's role. And so by taking away Dervish, I thought that helped break that allegory or create more distance, so it's not going to be as obvious to the players what's really going on. And to my knowledge, nobody really picked up on this, except that the main writer, Joe Staten, went to the media and told the whole story, which is why I'm telling it today, because otherwise I couldn't talk about it. So I'm kind of glad that he did that. But this is a good example of one where internal politics caused this to drag on for 8 months. The team would not change it because of internal political reasons. Basically, they didn't want outside interference with their creative process. And so this is one of those examples where I had to escalate all the way up to Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. And I still have the email somewhere where Bill was out of the country. So Steve responded to the email, 3 words, effing change it. And it was changed. So yeah, that was quite an ordeal. But anyway, so that got fixed. But that's another example of allegory. And it's pretty subtle, too. It's the kind of thing that I have to look for in my work. So when we're looking at building game worlds, essentially it's that real-world inspiration combined with imagination where people add to their core world building. And the culturalization process that I do starts at the very beginning. It starts at that concept phase when they're just kind of formulating the world, and that's where we start thinking about allegorical dissonance and some of the issues that they're going to present in the world, the story, the characters. We already start cultural research and consultation, including with outside experts, sensitivity readers, subject matter experts, and then they create the assets, implement them, and the world gets created. And depending on the game, this could be anywhere from 1 year to 5 years to 6 years, depending on what the scale of the game might actually be. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle that I worked over 3 years on, this was a great example of that, where I love the fact that this team, Machine Games, which is based in Uppsala, Sweden, they did a tremendous amount of work on making sure the world was authentic. That's one reason I was brought on board, because they are using real locations in Thailand, they're using the Giza Plateau, but they also, of course, are weaving a fictional narrative into these environments. So, for example, I brought on Egyptologists to help translate fictional text from the narrative into real hieroglyphs and hieratic script that would appear in different parts of the environment so that the players could engage with it and basically advance the story. But it all looks authentic. It all looks like it belongs there, and it is accurate because we know what players are going to do. They're going to screenshot this, and they will spend hours deciphering exactly what it says, and it says exactly what it's supposed to say. And we kept joking as we were developing this game that this game is probably far more culturally accurate than any of the films have ever been. But it was a great project to work on. What was really fun is that my dad, who taught geology for many years, for decades, he actually was one of the consultants, so I actually got to work with my dad on this game, which was pretty cool. And for some of those people who kept saying, like, your skills as a geographer or cartographer are not really relevant for the game industry, well, that's my globe for the collector's edition. They wanted to make a big globe for the collector's edition, so I helped design the globe there. So the skills can be useful at times. There's a lot of decisions a lot of factors we have to think about when we're making any one of these decisions. Like, let's say, for example, you're talking about changing a character design because of, I don't know, potential cultural appropriation. You have to first think about the developer's values and goals, which you could also say the company's values and goals. Are they willing to change something for China, for example, or not? Or for Korea, or for some other country? That's a really key conversation I often have with the companies I work with. The context in which content is generated is important because we have to remember, of course, that we're all biased. We all come from a specific language, culture, geography. Of course, we spend many years in school to overcome our bias. That's one reason we become educated. But what I've seen in the creative process, that bias often still creeps in. It just kind of is innate because they don't know what they don't know. And so we often see examples of this in different, well, not just, for example, developers in the US including things that are culturally ignorant, just like I see the same thing happening in East Asia, where I work on a lot of Japanese games, where they're doing things that are very, very like religiously or racially charged, because if you're, for example, a Japanese developer, Japan is 98% ethnic Japanese. So would you expect a Japanese developer to have an understanding, for example, of the interface between black and white characters, especially like in the US, and to the sensitivity level that the US has? We also think about the business strategy for the vertical, because if you're a big game company like Microsoft or Sony, you make a lot of products other than games. So this one decision could influence people's desire to buy your hardware or other software. We also think about the market strategy for the locale, because how we're selling into China, for example, is quite different from Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Germany, or other locales. We also have to think about the specific type of game, like first-person shooter. In Japan, for example, they don't play first-person shooters very much, but they play a lot of RPGs, role-playing games. So that is another factor too. If the game is a first-person shooter versus RPG versus FPS versus whatever. And then finally, the changing geopolitical, cultural, social, and legal factors, because I think we all have come to understand that the world is extremely dynamic. All it takes is one election somewhere and things kind of get turned on their head, especially in the age we're living in with increased populism, fascism, and other things kind of emerging, or I should say re-emerging 100 years later, right around now. For example, when the Ukraine invasion happened 3 years ago, a lot of the companies I work with were completely caught off guard. They had no idea what to do about this. They have players in Russia and Ukraine. They have Ukrainian content. They have Russian content. So they were really struggling, like, what are we supposed to do about this? And honestly, they should have already had some kind of strategy here. It's not the first time there's been some kind of geopolitical event, but this one in particular, I think, hit really hard in the game industry because so many companies used Ukrainian developers for outsourcing because they were extremely talented. So a lot of those Ukrainian developers were integral to a lot of companies, EA, Microsoft, Ubisoft. But now the developers are what? They're either going to war or they're fleeing Ukraine, and now they're relocating to Poland, Czech Republic, and elsewhere so that they can keep doing their work. So it was, so it's been very complicated for the industry to deal with this and kind of navigate through this. And of course, more recently, what's happening in Israel and Gaza, same thing again. We've had even more polarizing issues within the game industry as people are trying to deal with this and companies are trying to understand, what are we supposed to do? Because with Russia, Ukraine, it's easy. They're just like, you got to go against Russia and you support Ukraine. It's done. With this, there is no easy answer here, especially for a company. Like, where are you going to sit on this issue? And silence isn't always the best thing either. And then, of course, there's this, which, God, I don't even like talking about this. But even when this happened a few months ago, I've already had to advise clients on what to do about this because, now it's still kind of in the news. It's still going back and forth. There's even games, of course, that use Gulf of Mexico. But what happens then if a game uses Gulf of Mexico today? There's going to be a certain contingent of players based in the US who are aligned politically. They are going to review bomb the game and shitpost about it and be angry about it just because of this one issue. And so they're going to see the ratings drops and they're going to try and boycott the game. Boycotts typically are not very successful anyway, but they're going to try anyhow and make a big noise around it just because of this one issue, even if they love the game. But that's unfortunately some of the toxicity of the gaming community. I thought it was interesting that this one games journalist said if they're going to take a whole point off the review if any game says Gulf of America in it. So I'm interested to see if she actually follows through with that.